Alright, Tube, so we're back, of course, talking FF7, and we're talking, I guess technically because of the subject matter, we're kind of talking everything. OG FF7, we're talking Crisis Core, Before Crisis, Remake, Rebirth, kind of all of it. Because we're talking about Cloud, we're talking about Glenn, and the theory that Glenn is Cloud's dad. Glenn Lodbrok, of course, being the protagonist of the First Soldier side of the Ever Crisis story, but he also does make an appearance in Rebirth. This theory's existed for quite a while now, at least the last couple of years. I think pretty much since like the first time we seen Glenn in one of these First Soldier trailers, like I think maybe the TGS trailer or something like that back in 2021. To a certain degree, this theory probably initially originated simply because Glenn has blonde hair and it is kind of spiky, similar to Cloud's. Cloud does stylize his hair though. Maybe Glenn does too, I don't know actually. But to be fair, there's not a shit ton of like blonde characters in like the main cast for Final Fantasy VII. We're not talking about the random NPCs and shit in Remake and Rebirth. There's a shit ton of people. There's probably other blonde people. But with the main cast, it's really just like Cloud, Claudia, if you want to consider her main cast, but it's Cloud's mom. Like President Shinra, Rufus, Scarlet, and like Elena, right? And if we're talking about the main kind of important characters overall, so Glenn having blonde hair does stand out a little bit. Actually, speaking of that really quickly, there has been a theory for a very long time that maybe President Shinra is actually Cloud's dad, which would be a bit of a twist and make like Rufus his like half brother and shit. But I also think it'd be kind of fucked up to lie to Cloud if we're running with that idea. Like Claudia lying to Cloud and saying like his dad died a long time ago. Maybe it's better than saying it's President Shinra, but like at the same time it's kind of fucked up. But there could be something interesting there, but I just don't think that that's what they would do. Anyways, we talked about the possibility of Glenn being Cloud's father in a video, but I couldn't tell you what video it was because we talk about like several different subjects in almost every video we do on the channel because we're always covering random bits of news and information, right? But at another point too, I mentioned, I think in the comments of one of my videos, replying to somebody, that I was going to do a Glenn being Cloud's dad dedicated video at some point, and I think that was like last year, and obviously I never got around to making that video. But it's kind of good that we waited, because now we got Rebirth in our hands, and we obviously get quite a bit of Glenn in the game, so we can kind of talk about the subject a little bit more in depth. What actually inspired me to want to make this video finally is kind of a weird thing, but it is really, really interesting. But it was an observation made by my boy MJ Gallagher, or FF7 Novels on Twitter, writer of such books as Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. Shout out to my guy, by the way. I don't know if I've ever said this in a video, but he sent this to me for free like years ago. Just hook me up for free. Just send it to me. Which is pretty damn cool, of course, because he didn't have to do that. But it's been the backdrop of my videos pretty much since I've been doing like the face cam shit for the last like almost a year now. That in the background. But he pointed out that, of course, that's going to blur because why wouldn't it? That Cloud has a weapon in FF7 Rebirth that you could very much see Glenn using. Specifically, it points to the Igneous Saber, which has always stood out to me since playing Rebirth. Like, it's a really cool designed weapon, but it doesn't look like any of Cloud's other weapons. It doesn't look like any of Cloud's other weapons from Remake, and it doesn't look like any of Cloud's weapons from the original FF7. It just very much stands out. Especially if you can get like a really good quality picture of it, it just stands out, right? The back of it looks like it's made of almost bone. It looks like a spine or something. I initially thought it was like teeth. You obviously have the spikes on the front right here of it. It just stands out completely. It just looks like people compare it to like a sword that maybe looks like it's from Monster Hunter or like Elden Ring. My initial response when I first seen it was thinking of like the Soul Edge from Soul Calibur, though it doesn't have the giant eyeball on the side. It doesn't really look like the Soul Edge, but it's just like almost like a demonic sword, right? In reality, the darker look of the weapon is actually just because it has to do with like volcanic shit. It has to do with like magma and stuff like that. That's what the word igneous means. They even tell you that on the description of the weapon, that it's formed from magma. Go back to the Glenn stuff. Now, when it comes to Ever Crisis, Glenn and Cloud use different kinds of weapons. Obviously, Cloud uses swords, great swords, whatever. Glenn uses like axes, scythes, and hammers. But there's one weapon in his arsenal that's somewhat kind of resembles the Igneous Saber. And that is the Thousand Waves. If you just take a quick look at it, like, it's not too far off, right? Like, kind of the makeshift nature of it. Obviously, the spikes on the front, that's very close. It does have like a flower and shit on the side, which is quite different from the demonic-looking sword that is the Igneous Saber. But if you do them like side by side, man, they're not that far off. Especially if you take the Igneous Saber and kind of rotate it to a similar angle of the Thousand Waves, like that could be an axe for Glenn, right? You could, if you alter the blade a little bit or cut a little bit of the top of the blade off, that could be an axe, and that could be a weapon that Glenn could be using. I promise that's not the only thing the video is based on. It's just an interesting observation. It's a weapon that seems a little bit familiar to me, and that's maybe why. I was thinking maybe of Ever Crisis potentially. I don't know. There's a weapon that kind of resembles it that's in Glenn's arsenal. It's a weapon that you could see Glenn using if you were to alter it kind of slightly. What gets a little more interesting, though, is actually where you find this weapon at. When it comes to Rebirth, you find the Igneous Saber in the Nebel region, which by itself is obviously a little interesting, because it's Cloud's like hometown, home region, all that other shit. But specifically, you find the Igneous Saber on Mount Nebel, which you can't see it, but it's back here, traces to past. We get a little bit on Cloud's dad, and that's where he went missing, was somewhere on the mountain. They found like his gear or something, but they never found a body. There's never a body found. There's never confirmation of Cloud's dad dying. Actually, read this section about Cloud's dad really quickly, which I don't know if we've ever done on the channel, but it says, well, that's because she fell in love. You see, a man traveled here. Claudia was helping out at the end of the time. She must have been taken in by the outside air he brought with him. And he was a pretty fellow. I'm sure you see it when you look at Cloud. That boy got the best of both his parents. But just like the wind, he couldn't keep still. I'm not sure if Cloud learned how to walk yet, but around that time, he told her he would go to the mountains but never came back. They found his belongings, though. His body probably got eaten by monsters. You were lucky you didn't meet the same fate. To put that into context, you have a weapon in Rebirth that resembles something Glenn Lodbrok would probably use if you were to alter the weapon slightly. But also, you find it in the last place that Cloud's dad was known to be. Now, is it the strongest piece of evidence you ever seen for a theory? No, not really. This video is not trying to prove anything. We're not trying to prove that Glenn is for sure Cloud's dad. We're just drawing some interesting comparisons and some, connecting some dots here potentially. But what I will say, without even going further into the video here, I mean, there's got to be a reason they're being vague with Cloud's dad. I mean, over the entire compilation and everything, they've kind of never given us anything about the dad, but they talk about him in this book, but we still don't have a name yet. And there's got to be a reason for that, right? Whether that's, in Ever Crisis itself at some point, in the third game, maybe in more supplemental materials at some point. There's got to be like a mic drop of like, oh, this is Cloud's dad. Would that be Glenn? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I think he's a decent candidate. Something we did learn somewhat recently, too, is that Glenn was actually a character that was conceptualized for Rebirth. Like, that's his initial game he was going to be in, and eventually was moved on to like the First Soldier and Ever Crisis stuff, obviously. But he was initially going to be a character for Rebirth specifically, which is kind of interesting. Does that help the theory or hurt it? I don't know. When it comes to like a little bit of the time frame here, like Project Zero was approved by President Shinra in 1977, but Glenn was born in 1969, so he'd have been like 8 years old, right, at the time. So he's obviously not a part of Shinra at that point. There's obviously some history with Glenn, Matt, and Lucia, but they don't go on their first actual mission until 1992, which at that point, he's already an adult. He's already in his 20s. If we hop back just a little bit, Cloud was born in 1986, and I don't know that we have a confirmed age for Claudia, but there was character art for her, I think, from the original FF7 that said she was 33 years old when she died in the Nibelheim incident. If you do the math on that, that puts her at about the age of 17 or so when she had Cloud, when she gave birth to Cloud, right? So it's been theorized for a long time that Claudia was born in 1969, which puts her at the exact same age as Glenn. Now, will that remain true? I don't entirely know. I don't know if we're ever going to get like an actual age for Claudia, birth year, all that other shit. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But at least as of right now, Claudia and Glenn were born in the same year. And I find that to be highly coincidental, if not intentional. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, obviously Claudia had Cloud at a young age, right? She was either impregnated at the age of 16 or 17, but had him at the age of 17. Her and Glenn share a similar age, and it's possible that, Cloud was kind of an accident, right? Which sounds a little messed up, but that shit happens, right? You hook up with somebody, they accidentally get pregnant, your life changes forever. Whether or not Glenn was aware of the pregnancy, you could go either way with that, because he could have been in Nibelheim at that age doing like a Shinra mission of sorts, right? Because he was, 17 or so, 16, 17 at the time, which that's the age Cloud joined up with Shinra, right? So it could be possible that he was a part of Shinra at the time, just wasn't in the soldier program yet until obviously 1992. And then maybe he was there on a mission, they hooked up, she got pregnant, but he had to leave, right, because of his job. Maybe he wasn't aware of it until later on down the road when we get to Trace 2 Pass, whenever he obviously goes missing in the mountains. It could have also been that he was just traveling or something, or had some sort of job that brought him to the Nibelheim area and then hooked up with Claudia, and maybe he didn't have to leave. Maybe they were good for the first couple years, because we don't really have like a whole lot of backstory on Glenn, right? I don't know exactly when he joined up with Shinra, right? That's kind of the problem with talking about this shit, is we don't have exact time frames for everything just yet, and that's what maybe the Ever Crisis First Soldier story can give us as we go forward, if Glenn's even his damn dad anyways. Whether or not he actually goes missing, that could go either way too. Like, it could be that he was legitimately going up in the mountain for something, got attacked by monsters, got attacked by something, and then was taken away, maybe by the Shinra Company, to be experimented on for the soldier program inevitably. Also been that he wasn't where he had a kid until he went back to Nibelheim, and it maybe scared him, and he wanted to run from that responsibility. That's a very tropey thing to do. You see the movies all the time. Somebody hooks up. Years later, they meet the person they hooked up with. They have a kid. It's their kid, etc., right? It could have been like that was his excuse to kind of flee, right? I'm going to go up the mountains. I'm going to go do this for a little bit, and then ran away. Went to go get some milk, pack of cigarettes. As we talked about a lot on the channel, like the fact that Cloud's dad went up on the mountain and there's no body, like, yeah, you can write that off as like a monsters ate his body or some shit. But realistically, in most media, if you don't find a body, they're not dead, right? Which would lead a lot of us to believe, I would think, that Cloud's dad's going to show up somewhere down the line. Is it Glenn? Maybe, maybe not. Is it somebody else? Maybe, maybe not. Is it going to be like some weird experiment? Like, did Shinra get Cloud's dad's body and use it for experiment? Something Hojo would definitely do, right? You can go a ton of different ways with that, but the fact that there was no body found, I mean, come on. That generally means they're going to show up at a later point. Which also makes sense if it is Glenn, because we know how Glenn dies, right? Rufus shoots him in the back. We get that with Rebirth. I don't know if that's in Ever Crisis or not. But obviously, whenever Rufus shoots Glenn in the back at the end, he just says just like old times, right? So at some point somewhere, Rufus seems to be the one that kills Glenn. I also think it makes sense that Glenn could have a kid by what we see of his character with the Ever Crisis story. Now, I haven't played the whole thing. I played whatever's available at launch and like the first update to add more to the First Soldier story. But we see him multiple times help younger people, right? The kid that's on the Isle of Verdure, that is by himself with the dog, but then also young Sephiroth, right? He wants to help younger people, and that could be because he has a kid that he maybe can't be there for because of his job, or potentially it's a kid that, you know, he ran away from because he had a kid at a young age. Or it could just simply be that, you know, Glenn's just a nice guy and wants to help people that need help, which is certainly true. I mean, obviously we know that he wants to, like, help get some money for, like, his grandma or something like that with, like, the Ever Crisis First Soldier stuff or whatever. So it could go either way with that, but I just think it makes a little bit of sense with him. We see him helping younger people, that he could have a kid back home that he can't take care of. Something else that I find really interesting with Rebirth, which I'm glad that we kind of waited to do this video, is that we get to see Glenn in the game. Now, it's not obviously actually Glenn, because Glenn dies, but it's like Sephiroth taking the form of Glenn to fuck with Rufus. But we get to see Glenn with longer hair. But it's a kind of smaller detail. They do have similar kind of hair, right? Now, obviously, Cloud's hair is quite long, and at least according to lore, he does style it into the spikes and shit. But Glenn does have, with his hair grown out a bit, these kind of front spikes that come down forward, which is, you know, pretty much what Cloud does. But why I think this matters at all is that, for one, this isn't the real Glenn, right? This is Sephiroth taking the form of Glenn to fuck with Rufus. So Glenn could have looked like anything. Could have been like any iteration of Glenn ever in the history of his life. But also, the devs specifically designed a version of Glenn with longer hair, specifically hair that's not too far off from Cloud's. There's got to be a reason for that. Very similar to Cloud's dad's body missing. Why did they put that little nugget in that book? There's got to be a reason for that, right? Because they could have simply just had what Glenn looks like in fucking Ever Crisis, right? Like the CGI cutscenes from that. They could have put it, just copy, paste. Nobody was asking for longer hair Glenn, but they intentionally designed him that way. And I feel like there's a reason for it. Of course, we like to have these conversations from both sides if we can. The reason could be there was a mass desertion with like Genesis and shit during like the Crisis Core times, like I think the year 2000 or so. And I think he's a part of that, which is why we see him about to fight Sephiroth with some of the trailers for Ever Crisis and shit. I think that's happened around that same time, around the Fort Tamblin mission or something like that, is when the mass desertion's happening. And since he's potentially on the run from Shinner, that could be why the hair is longer, that's why the beard's growing out. That could be it. That could be all it is. But again, the hairstyle, I think, is very intentional. Whether or not any of this matters itself, whether or not Glenn is actually Cloud's dad or not, people seem to not realize that at some point they're going to give us something. Somewhere along the way, we're going to get history on Cloud's dad, right? And there's going to be some sort of payoff, I would think, to the body missing. So why not it be Glenn, right? It all kind of comes down to time frames and shit, though, right? Because obviously Cloud was conceived in like 85, 86. He was born 86. It depends on when Glenn exactly joined up with Shinra, joined up with the, you know, Soldier Program, all that shit. Obviously, the Soldier Program, Project Zero, was approved in like 77, which Glenn was a young kid at the time. But depending on, you know, a couple years later, he could have been a part of the Shinra Program, a part of the Soldier Program, could have been enhanced. Something I've talked about on the channel before is the possibility that if Glenn is Cloud's dad, him being enhanced by being a part of the Shinra company might be why Cloud is as strong as he is. Some people don't like that idea because they want Cloud to be like inherently strong. I totally get it, but like I've always found it a little bit weird that he's able to like go toe to toe with Sephiroth a little bit with the deployment incident. Right, he obviously doesn't actually outright fight him because he'd get slaughtered, but be able to sneak up on Sephiroth, stab him, and then obviously he gets stabbed and like throws Sephiroth into the Mako, all that shit. It'd make a little bit of sense if he has just that tiny bit of like Mako, that tiny bit of like Genova in him or something. Maybe, I don't know, starting out there. That's pretty much it for the video. I think we've kind of talked about this from all the angles we can currently until we have more information on Glenn or information at all on Cloud's dad. We might talk about it again down the road. Of course, what are your thoughts? Pass out to you guys. Is Glenn Cloud's father? What are your thoughts? After watching this video, is there more information we could derive that could either prove or disprove Glenn being Cloud's dad? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to if you guys are new, so works in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT. That's it.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.